Chicago, Illinois. The winter of 1977. A Thursday evening in the conference room of a mid-sized hotel on North Michigan Avenue, 2 blocks from the Chicago River. The room had been arranged for a press event. 12 chairs set in a loose semicircle facing a single chair at the front. A folding table along the wall with coffee and water. A portable tape recorder on the table nearest the door, its red light indicating that it was running. The hotel had hosted this kind of event before. Publishers, politicians, sports figures passing through the city on a promotional circuit, stopping for 90 minutes to answer questions from whoever showed up with a press credential and something to ask. The man in the single chair at the front had arrived 20 minutes early. He had reviewed the room the way he reviewed every room he walked into, which was completely cataloging the exits, the dimensions, the positions of the people already there. Then he had sat down and waited for the event to begin. His name was Joe Louis. He was 33 years old. He was 6 feet tall and 195 pounds, and he had been the heavyweight full-contact karate champion of America for the previous 3 years, and he was in Chicago because Black Belt magazine had arranged a promotional tour for the issue in which he appeared on the cover. He had done 4 of these events in the previous 6 days. New York, Philadelphia, Detroit. Now Chicago. He was good at them. He had learned how to answer the questions that journalists asked, which were usually the same questions in a different order, and he had learned how to say things that were true and interesting without saying things that were more than he intended to say. He was a private man doing a public job, and he had developed, over 3 years of being a public figure, a specific set of skills for managing the distance between those two things. The 12 chairs filled over the next 15 minutes. Sports journalists, 2 writers from martial arts publications, a feature writer from the Chicago Tribune who covered combat sports, a freelancer whose credential listed him as representing 3 different outlets, and a woman named Carol Bauer who wrote for a small magazine called Fighting Arts Quarterly that had been publishing for 2 years and had a readership of approximately 4,000 people. She was 29 years old. She wore a dark wool coat over a plain blouse, had a notepad on her knee and a pen in her hand, and had spent the previous 3 evenings reading every published interview Joe Louis had given in the previous 4 years. She had also read the academic literature on competitive stress and performance psychology that had begun appearing in sports science journals in the mid-1970s. She had prepared 6 questions. She intended to ask 2 of them. The other 4 were backups, in case the conversation went somewhere that made the first 2 unnecessary. She had a specific theory about Joe Louis that she wanted to test, and she had designed her questions to test it in a way that felt like conversation rather than examination. She was a careful journalist. She was also, on this particular Thursday evening, the most prepared person in the room other than the man in the single chair at the front. She had come to Chicago on a bus from Milwaukee, where she lived and worked. She had paid for the trip herself because Fighting Arts Quarterly did not have a travel budget. She had asked for the press credential 3 weeks in advance and had been told by the publicist handling the tour that the event was already at capacity, and she had written back explaining in 2 careful paragraphs why her publication's readership was exactly the audience that the tour was designed to reach, and the publicist had added her name to the list. She did not know, when she took her seat in the semicircle of chairs, that she was about to ask the question that would be reprinted in martial arts publications for the next 2 decades. She did not know that the answer to that question would be described, by 3 separate writers across 3 separate decades, as the most honest thing a champion had ever said in public about the limits of his own certainty. She knew only that she had prepared carefully and that the man in the chair at the front of the room had never, in 4 years of interviews, been asked the thing she intended to ask him. The event began at 7. A hotel staff member closed the door to the conference room from the outside. The tape recorder on the table by the door, which belonged to the Tribune writer, was already running. The first 40 minutes followed the pattern that these events always followed. Questions about his training regimen. Questions about his upcoming fights. Questions about the growth of full-contact karate as a sport and where he thought it was going. Questions about Bruce Lee, which he answered briefly and with the specific economy of a man who has been asked about a friend who has died and has decided how much of that friendship is his to share publicly and how much belongs to him alone. He answered all of it in the tone of a man who is present and engaged in giving the questioner what they need without giving them more than he has decided to give. The 12 journalists wrote in their notepads or did not write, depending on whether what Lewis was saying was something they had not heard before or a variation of something they had. For the first 40 minutes, most of them did not write very much. Then the freelancer asked the question that changed the direction of the room. He asked Lewis whether, in his career, he had ever encountered a fighter he genuinely believed he could not handle. It was a standard question. It was the kind of question that athletes get asked in promotional contexts and have a standard answer for, the answer being a diplomatic acknowledgement of respect for all competitors combined with a confident assertion of one's own capability. Joe Louis gave the standard answer. He said that he had enormous respect for every man he had competed against and every serious fighter in any style. He said that he approached every opponent as a serious challenge. He said that preparation and focus were the only things that mattered on the day. It was a well-constructed non-answer and everyone in the room recognized it as such, and the freelancer nodded and wrote something and the event moved on to the next question. What nobody in the room noticed, except Carol Bauer, was that Joe Louis had answered a question that had not quite been the question asked. The question had been whether he had ever encountered someone he genuinely believed he could not handle. He had answered a question about respect for opponents and the importance of preparation. Those were related topics. They were not the same topic. Carol Bauer had written a single word in her notepad when he finished. The word was not the question. It was an observation about the space between the question and the answer. She waited. She had learned over years of doing this work that the timing of a question in a press context was determined not only by the question itself but by the state of the room when it was asked. A room that had been listening to the same kind of question for 40 minutes developed a specific receptivity to a different kind of question, the way a palate that has been eating one flavor becomes suddenly sensitive to the arrival of another. She had watched the room spend 40 minutes receiving answers it had received before in different configurations. She had watched the journalists write when something was new and stop writing when something was a variation of something already written. She had watched Joe Louis give the room what it needed without giving it more than he had decided to give, and she had watched him do this smoothly and without visible effort, which told her that he had been doing it for long enough that it no longer required effort. She was waiting for the moment when the room's guard dropped, when the event moved from its prepared middle section into the unprepared territory that existed between the last planned question and the end of the scheduled time. She waited through 2 more questions from the sports journalists and 1 from the Tribune writer. She waited the way a person waits when they have decided that the timing of a question is as important as the itself, and that the right moment has not yet arrived. Then there was a pause in the room of the kind that pauses in press events acquire when the prepared questions have run out and nobody has yet decided what comes next. Carol Bauer looked at her notepad. Then she looked at Joe Louis. She asked her first question. She said that she had noticed that when the previous question was asked, about whether he had ever encountered someone he could not handle, he had answered a slightly different question than the one that was asked. She said this without accusation. She said it the way a person identifies an observation and offers it back to its subject as an invitation rather than a challenge. She asked whether he would be willing to answer the question that had actually been asked. The room shifted. The shift was small and specific, the shift that happens in a press room when a question arrives that is different in kind from the questions that preceded it. The sports journalists who had been half listening while they considered their next question were now listening completely. The Tribune writer had stopped writing mid-sentence and was looking at Lewis. The tape recorder on the table by the door continued running with the specific indifference of machines to the significance of what they are recording. Joe Louis looked at Carol Bauer for a moment. Not a long moment. Long enough to read the question accurately, which was what he always did before he answered anything. He had been asked a version of this question before. He had never been asked it quite this precisely, by someone who had clearly noticed the evasion in real time and was naming it without hostility and offering him the opportunity to say something true instead of something useful. He said that he appreciated the precision of the observation. He said it without irony. Then he was quiet for several seconds. The several seconds of a man who is deciding something, not about whether to answer, but about how far into the true answer he is willing to go in a room with 11 journalists and a tape recorder. He said that there was one fighter he had thought about in those terms. He said it carefully. He said that he had never competed against this man. He said that he had trained with him, had felt what the man produced in a training context, and had formed a specific private assessment that he had not shared publicly because the man in question was no longer alive to respond to it. He said the name. He said Bruce Lee. He said it in the flat, careful tone of a man releasing something he has held for a long time and is releasing only as far as the specific truth of the question requires. He said that in the training context, in the specific range and at the specific distances that Bruce Lee operated at, he had never found a reliable answer. He said that this was not a public statement about who would win a competition between them because competitions have rules and rules change what is possible. He said that it was an honest answer to an honest question, which was whether there was anyone he had encountered whom he could not be certain of handling. He said yes. There was one. And he had been the man's student. The room was quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that lands differently than anything that has been said in the preceding 40 minutes. The sports journalists were all writing now. The Tribune writer had gone back to the sentence he had stopped mid-word and crossed it out and started a new line. The freelancer was looking at his notepad and then at Lewis and then at his notepad again with the expression of a man who came in expecting one kind of story and has just been handed a different and more interesting one. Carol Bauer wrote 3 words in her notepad. She did not ask a follow-up question. She had asked the question she came to ask. She had received an answer that was more complete than she had designed the question to produce. She understood, with the specific understanding of a journalist who has been doing this long enough to know when to stop, that the right response to what had just been said was silence, and that any follow-up question she asked would make the answer smaller rather than larger. She clicked the cap back onto her pen. She set the pen on top of the notepad. She looked at Joe Louis with an expression that was not satisfaction, because satisfaction is a thing you feel when something goes the way you planned, and what had just happened had not gone the way she planned. It had gone further. The expression was the one a person has when they have asked a question and received, in place of the answer they expected, the truth. Joe Louis sat in the single chair at the front of the room. He was breathing normally. He had not changed his posture. He had not performed anything in the previous 2 minutes that he had not performed in any of the previous 40. He had simply answered a question honestly when given the opportunity to do so, in the specific way that honest men answer questions when the questioner has created the conditions in which honesty is the most natural response. The remaining 20 minutes of the event were not empty. Other questions were asked and answered. The tape recorder continued running. The notepads continued filling. But the room had a different quality than it had before Carol Bauer's question, the quality of a room in which something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that changes the meaning of everything said before it and after it. The journalist filed out at 8:30. Several of them spoke briefly with Lewis as they left. The freelancer said that he had not expected that. Lewis said that he had not either, entirely. The Tribune writer said nothing on his way out. He had already written the first paragraph of his piece in his head and wanted to get back to his hotel room before he lost any of it. Carol Bauer was the last to leave. She stopped at the door and looked back at Lewis, who was still sitting in the single chair, the only person left in the room besides the hotel staff member who was beginning to stack the folding chairs against the wall. She said that she was grateful for the answer. Lewis nodded once. She went through the door. The tape recorder on the table by the door had reached the end of its tape and stopped running some minutes earlier, which meant that the last exchange of the evening existed only in the notepads of 12 journalists and in the memory of everyone who had been in that room. The piece that Carol Bauer wrote for Fighting Arts Quarterly appeared 6 weeks later. It was the most widely read thing the magazine had ever published. The question about Bruce Lee occupied one paragraph near the end. That paragraph was the one that people remembered. That paragraph was the one quoted in other pieces for the next 20 years. That paragraph was the one that Joe Louis, when asked about it in later interviews, confirmed was accurate and declined to add anything further to. He had said what he needed to say on a Thursday evening in Chicago in the winter of 1977. He had said it because a 29-year-old journalist from a magazine with 4,000 readers had asked him a question precisely enough that the honest answer was the easiest one to give. That was all it had taken. A question precise enough to make honesty the path of least resistance. And a man honest enough to take it.